You are sitting there right now, perhaps with a cup of coffee growing cold beside you, staring at numbers that refuse to make sense no matter how many times you add them up. You are 60 years old, or perhaps 62, maybe 65, and somewhere in the back of your mind there is a voice that sounds suspiciously like every financial advisor you have ever met, telling you that you must pay off all your debts before retirement, that you must enter your golden years free and clear, that anything less is financial failure of the highest order. And so you have been sacrificing, scraping together every spare dollar, cutting back on the small pleasures that make life worth living, all in service of a goal that society has convinced you is the only path to financial righteousness. But I am going to tell you something today that may initially feel like heresy, something that goes against everything you have been told, something that might even make you uncomfortable at first. But I need you to hear me clearly because what I am about to share with you could change the entire trajectory of your financial future in ways you never imagined possible. The conventional wisdom about debt after 60 is not just incomplete, it is fundamentally wrong, and following it blindly may be costing you not just money, but peace of mind, opportunities, and even years of your life spent in unnecessary worry and struggle. I know exactly how you feel right now because I have sat across from thousands of people just like you, people of deep faith who genuinely believe they are doing the right thing, people who have been taught their entire lives that debt is a burden to be eliminated at all costs, people who quote scripture about the borrower being slave to the lender without understanding the full context of biblical financial wisdom. And here you are, perhaps working extra hours that your body no longer wants to work, perhaps denying yourself the joy of helping your grandchildren, perhaps lying awake at night calculating whether you can make that extra payment this month while still keeping the lights on. The weight of this pressure is crushing you, and the worst part is that you do not even realize there might be another way, a smarter way, a way that actually honors the resources God has entrusted to you, rather than squandering them in service of a goal that may not even make sense for your situation. I want you to understand that the anxiety you feel right now, that tightness in your chest when you think about your finances, that fear about whether you will have enough, all of that comes from following advice that was never designed for someone like you in the first place. The rules that apply to a 30-year-old building wealth are not the same rules that apply to someone who has already built their foundation and is now in the stewardship phase of their financial journey. What I am going to share with you today is not some get-rich-quick scheme or a way to avoid your responsibilities. Far from it. What I am going to teach you is the sophisticated understanding of money that the wealthiest families in history have always known, but rarely shared. This is the same philosophy that allowed my family to build generational wealth that has lasted more than a century. The same principles that separate those who truly understand money from those who simply work for it their entire lives. And more importantly, these principles align perfectly with the deeper biblical understanding of stewardship that goes far beyond the surface-level interpretations most people have been taught. You see, God did not call us to be slaves to arbitrary financial rules created by people who profit from our fear. He called us to be wise stewards, shrewd managers of the resources He has placed in our care, and that requires understanding money at a level most people never achieve. By the time you finish listening to everything I have to share today, you will see your financial situation through entirely different eyes, and more importantly, you will have a clear path forward that honors both your faith and your future. The conventional debt payoff wisdom that has been drilled into your head is based on an assumption that made sense in a different era but no longer applies to the world we live in today. When your grandparents were building their lives, debt was simple, interest rates were straightforward, and the financial system worked in predictable ways. But the world has changed dramatically, and yet the advice we give to people over 60 has remained frozen in time, like a fossil from a different age that we continue to worship without questioning whether it still makes sense. Think about it clearly for a moment. You have been told that paying off your mortgage early is always the right decision, that eliminating all debt before retirement is the responsible thing to do, that carrying any balance into your 60s is a sign of financial irresponsibility. But have you ever stopped to ask who benefits from this advice? Have you ever wondered why banks are so eager to have you pay off your mortgage early when they are in the business of making money from lending? The answer, when you see it clearly, will change everything you think you know about money. Here is the truth that nobody wants to tell you. In many cases, aggressively paying off debt after 60 is actually one of the worst financial decisions you can make. I know that statement probably sent a shock through your system, and I understand why. It goes against everything you have been taught. But stay with me here because the mathematics do not lie, and once you understand the numbers, you will never look at your finances the same way again. When you take every extra dollar you have and throw it at your mortgage or other low-interest debt, you are not just paying down principal. You are making a choice about how to deploy your limited resources, and that choice has consequences that most people never consider. Every dollar you use to pay down a 3% mortgage is a dollar that cannot earn 7 or 8 or 10% in the market. Every dollar you pour into eliminating debt is a dollar that cannot provide liquidity in an emergency. Every dollar you sacrifice today in service of debt freedom is a dollar that cannot be multiplied through strategic investment. The opportunity cost of aggressive debt payoff after 60 is staggering when you actually run the numbers, and yet most people never even think to calculate it. Let me paint a picture for you that will make this real. Imagine two people, both 62 years old, both with identical financial situations. They each have $200,000 remaining on their mortgage at 3.5% interest, and they each have an extra $500 per month they could put toward financial goals. Person A follows the conventional advice. They take that $500 every single month and make extra principal payments on their mortgage. They sacrifice and struggle, and after 10 years, at 72 years old, they finally make that last payment and own their home free and clear. They feel accomplished. They feel responsible. They followed all the rules. But here is what they do not have. They do not have a penny more in liquid assets than they had when they started. If an emergency strikes, if a medical crisis hits, if a child or grandchild needs help, they have to either tap into their home equity through expensive products or simply say they cannot help. All their extra wealth is locked up in an illiquid asset that they cannot access without selling their home or taking on new debt. Now consider person B. They take that same $500 per month, but instead of making extra mortgage payments, they invest it systematically in a diversified portfolio. They understand that over the past century, the market has returned an average of around 10% annually, and even with conservative assumptions, they can reasonably expect 7% or more over a 10-year horizon. After 10 years, person B has not paid off their mortgage early. They still owe money on their home. But here is what they do have. They have built an investment portfolio worth somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000, depending on market condition. They have liquidity. They have flexibility. They have options. And here is the beautiful part that most people miss entirely. If they wanted to, they could take a portion of those investments and pay off their remaining mortgage balance in one stroke. But they also have the choice not to, because they understand that the arbitrage between their low mortgage rate and their investment returns is actually making them money every single month. They maintain that mortgage. This is what I mean when I say you need to stop thinking about debt the way you have been taught and start thinking about it the way wealthy families have always thought about it. To us, debt is not inherently good or bad. It is a tool, like a hammer or a saw. A hammer in the wrong hands can destroy, but in the right hands it builds. Debt at high interest rates with no strategic purpose is indeed destructive, and I would never suggest otherwise. But debt at historically low rates, secured against appreciating assets, serving a strategic purpose in your overall financial plan, that kind of debt can actually be a wealth-building tool when properly understood and managed. The question is not whether you have debt. The question is whether your debt is working for you or against you, and most people over 60 have never been taught how to make that distinction. I want to pause here for a moment and speak directly to your heart, because I know some of you are feeling conflicted right now. You are thinking about that verse in Proverbs about the borrower being servant to the lender, and you are wondering how what I am saying could possibly align with Scripture. This is such an important question, and I want to address it directly because I would never ask you to abandon your faith in pursuit of financial gain. That would be trading eternal treasure for temporal comfort, and no amount of money is worth compromising your walk with God. But here is what I need you to understand. The Bible is a book of wisdom, not a book of rigid rules divorced from context. When Solomon wrote those words about debt, he was speaking to an agricultural society where debt typically meant borrowing against future harvest, where a bad year could mean losing everything. where debt was often predatory and exploitative. He was warning against the kind of debt that truly does enslave, the kind that keeps people trapped in cycles of poverty and dependence. But Solomon was also the wisest man who ever lived, and his wisdom extends far beyond surface-level interpretation. The same Solomon who warned about debt also wrote extensively about the wisdom of building wealth, about the virtue of planning for the future, about the importance of leaving an inheritance for your children's children. The same scriptures that speak of the dangers of debt also celebrate the faithful steward who multiplies what has been entrusted to him, who plants vineyards and builds storehouses, who invests wisely and grows abundance from seeds of wisdom. Biblical financial wisdom is not about following rigid rules. It is about understanding principles deeply enough to apply them correctly to your specific situation. A 3% mortgage on your home is not the same as borrowing from a loan shark to fund consumption you cannot afford. To treat them as equivalent is not wisdom. It is blindness masquerading as righteousness. I can feel some of you starting to see this differently now, and I want to know what has been holding you back. What is the specific struggle that keeps you awake at night when it comes to your finances? Maybe it is the constant pressure to pay off debt that makes you feel like you are running on a treadmill that never ends. Maybe it is the fear that you have not saved enough for retirement, even though you have been trying your whole life. Maybe it is the guilt you feel when you spend anything on yourself, because you have been taught that sacrifice is always virtuous, even when that sacrifice is destroying your health and stealing your peace. I want you to pause right now and really think about this, because understanding your specific pain point is the first step toward transformation. If you feel comfortable, drop a comment below and share your struggle. You can simply write, "My biggest financial struggle after 60 is blank, and I want to overcome it because blank." Your story matters, and sharing it might be the first step toward breakthrough, not just for you but for others who are silently struggling with the same challenges. Sometimes just naming our struggles takes away some of their power over us, and this community is a safe place where no one will judge you for the financial pressures you are facing. We have all been there, and together we are going to find a better way forward. Now let me take you deeper into this philosophy because understanding the concept is only the beginning. You need practical wisdom for how to actually implement these principles in your own life, and that requires understanding some key distinctions that most financial education completely ignores. Not all debt is created equal, and not all payoff strategies make sense for every situation. The key variables you need to consider are interest rate, liquidity, tax treatment, and strategic purpose. Let me walk you through each of these because once you understand how they interact, you will have a framework for making wise decisions about any debt situation you encounter. Interest rate is the most obvious factor, and yet most people apply it incorrectly. They think any debt is bad debt, and therefore all debt should be eliminated as quickly as possible. But this ignores the concept of opportunity cost that I mentioned earlier. Here is a simple principle. If your debt interest rate is lower than the after-tax return, you can reasonably expect from investing. Paying off that debt early actually costs you money. Read that again because it might be the most important financial insight you receive this year. When you aggressively pay down a 3% mortgage while foregoing 8% investment returns, you are not being responsible. You are destroying wealth, dollar by dollar, month by month. Now this calculation changes dramatically with high-interest debt. If you are carrying credit card balances at 18 or 20 or 24% interest, that debt is destroying you, and you should absolutely prioritize eliminating it as quickly as possible. There is no investment strategy that reliably returns 20% annually, so carrying high-interest debt while trying to invest is like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. But low-interest debt secured against appreciating assets? That is an entirely different calculation, and treating it the same as credit card debt is financially illiterate. Liquidity is the second factor that most people completely overlook, and for those over 60, it may actually be the most important consideration of all. When you pour all your extra resources into paying down your mortgage, you are converting liquid assets into a liquid home equity. Yes, your net worth might look the same on paper, but net worth is not what pays medical bills when an unexpected diagnosis hits. Net worth is not what allows you to help your children when they face hardship. Net worth is not what provides options and flexibility when life throws you curves you never expected. Liquidity does all of those things, and once you reach 60, liquidity becomes exponentially more valuable because the uncertainty of life increases while your ability to recover from setbacks decreases. I have seen countless people who followed the conventional advice, paid off their homes early, and then faced a health crisis or other emergency with no liquid resources to draw upon. They ended up taking out reverse mortgages or home equity lines of credit at terrible terms because they had no other choice. All that sacrifice, all those extra payments, all that denial of present enjoyment, and they ended up right back in debt anyway, but now with worse terms and less flexibility than if they had simply maintained their original mortgage and built liquid wealth on the side. Tax treatment is another factor that sophisticated wealth builders understand deeply, but average people rarely consider. Mortgage interest, in many cases, is still tax deductible, which means the effective interest rate you are paying is actually lower than the stated rate. If you are in a combined federal and state tax bracket of 25% and your mortgage rate is 4%, your after-tax cost of that debt is only 3%. Meanwhile, your investment returns are typically taxed at lower capital gains rates if you hold for more than a year, and certain investments like municipal bonds can provide tax-free income entirely. When you factor in the tax advantages of maintaining mortgage debt while investing in tax-efficient vehicles, the arbitrage becomes even more compelling. This is how wealthy families think about money. They do not make decisions based on emotional reactions to the word debt. They make decisions based on rigorous analysis of after-tax returns, risk-adjusted costs, and long-term wealth optimization. Strategic purpose is the final factor, and in many ways it is the most important because it gets to the heart of why you are making any financial decision in the first place. What is the purpose of your wealth? What are you trying to accomplish with your financial resources? If your goal is simply to die with a paid-off house and no other assets, then by all means, pay off your mortgage as quickly as possible. But if your goal is to leave a legacy, to have resources to help family members in need, to maintain flexibility and options throughout your retirement years, to have the ability to give generously to causes you care about, then you need to think more strategically about how you deploy your capital. A paid-off house does not fund your grandchild's education. A paid-off house does not allow you to make a major gift to your church when they are building a new sanctuary. A paid-off house does not provide income in retirement or give you options if your circumstances change. These are the strategic considerations that matter when you are building wealth for purpose, rather than simply following rules for the sake of following rules. Now, I want to address something that I know is coming up for some of you, and it is absolutely valid to ask this question. You are thinking, this all sounds good in theory, but what about the peace of mind that comes from owning your home free and clear? What about the security of knowing nobody can take your house from you? What about the emotional weight that lifts when you make that final payment? These are real considerations, and I would never minimize the psychological value of feeling debt-free. Our emotional relationship with money is powerful, and financial decisions that look optimal on paper but leave you unable to sleep at night are not truly optimal for you. But here is what I want you to consider. Much of the emotional distress around debt comes from narratives we have been taught rather than from the debt itself. We have been conditioned to feel shame about debt, to see it as a moral failing, to believe that carrying any balance makes us irresponsible or somehow less than. These emotional reactions are learned, which means they can also be unlearned. When you truly understand the mathematics of wealth building, when you see clearly that maintaining low-interest debt while investing the difference is actually the smarter play, when you recognize that liquidity and flexibility serve your family better than a paid-off house with no other assets, something shifts in your psychology. The emotional weight of debt begins to lift not because the debt is gone, but because you understand its true nature and its proper place in your overall financial strategy. You stop seeing it as a burden and start seeing it as a tool, and that shift in perspective brings its own kind of peace. I am not saying this transition is easy or instant. Old beliefs die hard, and the conditioning around debt runs deep in our culture. But I am telling you that the peace you are seeking is available to you without sacrificing decades of wealth-building opportunity to achieve it. The peace comes from understanding, from having a plan, from knowing that your resources are being deployed wisely rather than sacrificed on the altar of conventional wisdom that does not even apply to your situation. Let me share with you now the specific framework that I recommend for people over 60 who are trying to navigate debt decisions wisely. This is not one-size-fits-all advice because your specific situation will always have unique factors that need to be considered. But these principles will give you a foundation for thinking through your options in a way that optimizes for your actual goals rather than arbitrary rules that may not serve you. First, categorize all your debt by interest rate and create clear tiers. Any debt above 10% interest should be considered high priority for elimination. This typically includes credit cards, personal loans, and some car loans. This debt is almost always destroying wealth, and there are very few scenarios where carrying it makes sense. Get rid of it as quickly as you reasonably can. Debt between 5 and 10% falls into a gray zone that requires more careful analysis. Depending on your specific circumstances, tax situation, and risk tolerance, this debt may be worth accelerating or may be acceptable to carry. Debt below 5%, particularly when secured against appreciating assets and potentially tax-advantaged, should generally not be prioritized for early payoff over wealth-building investment. Second, ensure you have adequate liquidity before making any additional debt payments. I recommend that people over 60 maintain at least 6 months of expenses in easily accessible savings before accelerating debt payoff. Some financial planners will tell you 3 months is enough, but they are not accounting for the increased risk and decreased recovery capacity that comes with age. A job loss at 30 is an inconvenience. A job loss at 62 can be a catastrophe if you do not have resources to bridge the gap. Medical emergencies become more likely with each passing year, and the costs can be staggering even with insurance. Home repairs, family emergencies, unexpected expenses of all kinds, these are the realities of life, and facing them without liquid resources is a recipe for financial disaster regardless of how little debt you carry. Third, establish systematic investment before making additional debt payments. This is where most people get it backwards. They think paying off debt should come first and investing second. But this sequence destroys wealth for anyone carrying low-interest debt. The power of compound growth means that every year you delay investing costs you exponentially in lost returns. A dollar invested at 60 that compounds at 7% for 20 years becomes nearly $4. A dollar used to pay down a 3% mortgage at 60 saves you maybe 60 cents in interest over those same 20 years. The math is not even close, and yet people sacrifice the $4 outcome for the 60-cent outcome because they do not understand how wealth actually grows. Fourth, understand the specific rules around retirement accounts and take maximum advantage of tax-advantaged opportunity. If your employer offers matching contributions to a retirement account, failing to capture that match is literally throwing away free money, regardless of what debt you carry. The match represents an immediate 50% or 100% return on your contribution, which beats any debt payoff by a mile. Even beyond the match, contributions to traditional retirement accounts reduce your current tax burden while allowing investments to grow tax-deferred. Depending on your income and state tax rates, the tax savings alone can make contributing more valuable than paying down low-interest debt. Fifth, consider the role of insurance in your overall financial strategy. Many people over 60 are paying for life insurance they no longer need, while simultaneously paying down debt they should be maintaining. If your children are grown and financially independent, if your spouse would have adequate resources without your income, if you have no dependents who would suffer financially from your death, then expensive life insurance premiums might be better redirected toward wealth building. Conversely, long-term care insurance and adequate health coverage become increasingly important as you age, and maintaining liquidity to cover insurance costs is essential to protecting everything you have built. If you are finding this valuable, if something I have said today has shifted your perspective or opened your eyes to possibilities you had not considered, I want to invite you to take a simple step that will serve you well in the months and years ahead. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss these insights when they come out. I know you did not stumble upon this content by accident. There is something stirring in you, a recognition that the path you have been on is not leading where you want to go, a hunger for wisdom that goes deeper than the surface-level advice that dominates most financial education. I created this channel specifically for people like you, people of faith who want to build wealth in alignment with biblical principles, but who know intuitively that there must be more to the story than the simplistic rules most teachers offer. Every week, I share insights that took my family generations to understand, principles that have been tested across boom and bust cycles, wisdom that can genuinely transform your financial future if you apply it consistently. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you are making a commitment to your own growth, and I am making a commitment to pour into you everything I have learned about building wealth that lasts and leaving a legacy that matters. This is not just about money. This is about stewardship, about honoring the resources God has given you, about positioning yourself to be a blessing to your family and community for years to come. Let me now address some of the objections that I know are forming in your mind, because I have had this conversation hundreds of times, and I know exactly what hesitations come up for thoughtful people when they first encounter these ideas. The first objection is usually something like, "But what if the market crashes right after I invest?" This is a valid concern, and it deserves a thoughtful answer. Yes, markets do crash. They crashed in 2008. They crashed in 2020. They have crashed many times throughout history, and will crash many times in the future. But here is what else is true. They have also always recovered, and they have trended upward over every meaningful time horizon. Someone who invested at the absolute peak before the 2008 crash and then did nothing but hold through the recovery was back to even within a few years, and significantly ahead within a decade. The key is not to avoid market fluctuation, which is impossible anyway. The key is to have a long enough time horizon and enough diversification that short-term volatility does not matter to your long-term outcomes. The second objection I often hear is, "I am over 60, so I do not have enough time for the market to recover if something goes wrong." This reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of retirement planning that I need to correct. When you retire, you do not suddenly need all your money on day one. A 65-year-old retiring today may have a 30-year time horizon or longer given modern life expectancy. That is plenty of time for a diversified portfolio to weather any storm and come out ahead. Yes, you need to be more conservative with the portion of your portfolio you will draw upon in the near term. But the money you will not need for 10 or 15 or 20 years, that can and should remain invested in growth-oriented assets. The biggest risk most retirees face is not market volatility. It is outliving their money because they were too conservative and did not allow their wealth to grow. The third objection is about security of knowing the house is paid off. We touched on this earlier, but let me go deeper. The security you feel from a paid-off house is largely psychological rather than real. A paid-off house does not protect you from property taxes, which can force you to sell if you cannot pay them. A paid-off house does not protect you from major maintenance expenses that can run into tens of thousands of dollars. A paid-off house does not protect you from the need for cash when emergencies strike. True security comes from having resources, options, and flexibility. True security comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you because you have the financial capacity to respond. A paid-off house with no other assets is not security. It is an illusion of security that can shatter the moment life throws you a curveball you were not expecting. The fourth objection relates to leaving the house to your children. Many people want to pass down a paid-off home as part of their legacy, and this is a noble goal that I absolutely support. But here is a perspective shift that might serve you. From a pure wealth transfer standpoint, your children might be better served by inheriting a house with a small remaining mortgage plus a substantial investment portfolio than by inheriting a paid-off house with nothing else. The house will transfer to them either way. The question is, what else transfers alongside it? A $500,000 home with a $100,000 mortgage remaining plus a $300,000 investment portfolio is a more valuable inheritance than a $500,000 paid-off home with no additional assets. Your children can choose to pay off the remaining mortgage from the portfolio and still have significant resources left over, or they can maintain the mortgage and keep the investments growing. You give them options rather than constraints. Now I want to teach you something that separates truly wealthy families from those who merely appear wealthy, and this is perhaps the most important wealth-building principle I can share with you today. The wealthy do not think about assets and liabilities the way most people do. Most people categorize things based on whether they own them free and clear or whether they owe money on them. The wealthy categorize things based on whether they produce cash flow or consume it. This mental shift changes everything about how you approach financial decisions. Under the common framework, A paid-off house is good because it has no associated liability. Under the wealthy framework, a paid-off house is neutral at best because it produces no cash flow and actually consumes money through taxes, insurance, maintenance, and opportunity cost. The wealthy understand that a rental property with a mortgage that generates $200 per month in positive cash flow after all expenses is a better asset than an empty lot they own free and clear that produces nothing and costs money to maintain. They understand that debt used to acquire cash-flowing assets is fundamentally different from debt used to finance consumption. They build portfolios of assets that produce income regardless of whether those assets have associated debt, because they know that income is what funds lifestyle, provides security, and builds lasting wealth. This is not about being reckless with debt or leveraging yourself to dangerous levels. It is about understanding that the question is never simply, "Do I have debt?" but rather, is my overall financial situation generating positive cash flow and building wealth over time? Apply this principle to your own situation. Instead of asking, "How can I pay off my mortgage faster?" ask, "How can I increase my monthly cash flow by the highest amount?" Instead of asking, "How can I eliminate all debt?" ask, "How can I maximize my risk-adjusted returns given my time horizon and circumstances?" Instead of asking, "What do I need to sacrifice to be debt-free?" ask, "What is the highest and best use of my financial resources given my goals and values?" These questions lead to very different answers than the conventional questions, and those different answers typically lead to dramatically different financial outcomes over time. Let me share with you now the psychological transformation that occurs when you truly internalize these principles, because the mental shift matters as much as the financial strategy. When you stop seeing debt as inherently evil and start seeing it as a tool to be used wisely, something profound happens in your relationship with money. The shame lifts. The constant anxiety about paying down balances relaxes. The desperate sacrifice of present enjoyment for future debt freedom gives way to a more balanced approach that honors both your present needs and your future security. You start to feel empowered rather than enslaved, strategic rather than struggling, in control rather than controlled. This psychological freedom is not a byproduct of wealth building. It is actually one of the key ingredients that makes wealth building possible in the first place. Think about how stress affects your decision-making. When you are anxious about money, when you feel constant pressure about debt, when every financial decision carries emotional weight, you are far more likely to make poor choices. You might panic, sell investments during market downturns because you cannot handle the emotional pressure. You might avoid necessary expenses because the guilt of spending anything feels overwhelming. You might work yourself into health problems because you feel you cannot afford to rest. The psychological burden of money anxiety is itself a wealth-destroying force, and relieving that burden through proper understanding and strategic planning is genuinely valuable beyond the direct financial benefit. I have watched people transform before my eyes when they truly get this. The tension in their shoulders releases. The worry lines on their faces soften. They start to see possibilities rather than problems, opportunities rather than obstacles. They begin making decisions from a place of abundance and wisdom rather than scarcity and fear. And here is the beautiful part. Their financial results actually improve once the psychological burden lifts, because they start thinking more clearly and making better decisions. Fear-based financial management is almost always inferior to wisdom-based financial management, even when the fearful person works harder and sacrifices more. Better thinking beats harder working every time when it comes to building wealth. Now let me speak directly to those of you who are sitting on the other extreme, who are using what I have said as justification for irresponsible financial behavior. This message is not permission to rack up debt carelessly, to stop making your regular payments, or to avoid any financial responsibility. I am not telling you that debt does not matter, or that you can borrow your way to wealth. What I am telling you is that the relationship between debt and wealth is more nuanced than conventional wisdom suggests, and that wise stewardship requires understanding this nuance rather than following simplistic rules. If you are carrying high-interest consumer debt because you could not control your spending, this message is not for you yet. You need to address the behavioral issues first. If you are behind on your payments and facing collection actions, this message is not your priority. You need to stabilize your situation before optimizing it. If you have no savings at all and are living paycheck to paycheck, This message requires context. Build your foundation before you start thinking about arbitrage. But for those of you who have done the basics, who have stable income and controlled expenses, who have some savings, and are now trying to figure out the best way to deploy additional resources, the principles I am sharing today can genuinely transform your financial trajectory. You are the people I am speaking to primarily, and you are the people who have the most to gain from understanding these concepts deeply. There is a parable in Scripture that has always fascinated me, and I believe it speaks directly to what we are discussing today. You know it well, the parable of the talent. A master entrusts his servants with resources according to their ability. Two servants take their resources and multiply them through strategic investment. One servant, afraid of loss and desperate for security, buries his talent in the ground where it remains safe, but does not grow. When the master returns, he is pleased with the servants who multiplied what was given to them, and harsh with the servant who let fear prevent him from growing the resources under his care. Now, most interpretations focus on the spiritual meaning of this parable, and those meanings are profound. But there is also direct financial wisdom here that I think most people miss entirely. Notice that the servants who pleased the master were those who took risk with the resources entrusted to them. They did not simply preserve what they were given, they invested it, knowing that investment carries the possibility of loss. The servant who was condemned was the one who prioritized absolute safety over growth, who let fear drive his financial decisions, who refused to take any risk even when the expected return justified it. This is remarkably close to what we have been discussing today. The person who takes every spare dollar and buries it in mortgage payoff is like the servant who buried his talent. Yes, the house becomes more secure. Yes, the risk of loss decreases. But the opportunity for multiplication is completely abandoned. The master's money sits in the ground, safe but stagnant, while it could have been growing through wise deployment. I am not suggesting that paying down your mortgage is sinful, or that aggressive debt payoff condemns you spiritually. Please do not misunderstand me. But I am suggesting that the conventional financial wisdom many Christians follow is more aligned with the fearful servant than with the faithful stewards who multiplied their resources. God has given you resources to manage. He expects you to be wise with them, not fearful. He expects you to grow what you have been given, not simply to preserve it at all costs. The biblical mandate for stewardship is not avoid all risk and prioritize safety above all else. It is take what you have been given and multiply it through wisdom and faithful action. This connects to a broader truth about the Christian life that I think many believers miss. We serve a God of abundance, not scarcity. We follow a Savior who multiplied loaves and fishes, who turned water into wine, who promised life in abundance to those who follow Him. The gospel is fundamentally a message of more, not less. More love, more grace, more power, more hope, more life. And yet somehow, when it comes to money, many Christians adopt a scarcity mindset that seems completely disconnected from everything else they believe. They think holiness requires poverty, that spirituality requires sacrifice, that loving God requires hating wealth. But this is not what Scripture teaches when you read it carefully and in context. Abraham was wealthy, Job was wealthy before his trials, and wealthy again after his restoration. Solomon was the wealthiest man of his age, and received his wealth as a blessing from God. David accumulated enormous resources for the temple he would never build. These were not worldly compromises. They were faithful stewards who understood that wealth is a tool for accomplishing God's purposes in the world. The question is never whether you should have wealth. The question is whether you will use whatever wealth you have, whether great or small, in service of God's purposes and in accordance with His wisdom. And that wisdom, when properly understood, includes sophisticated thinking about assets, liabilities, and the strategic deployment of resources. As we move toward the close of our time together today, I want to give you some specific action steps you can take to begin implementing what you have learned. Knowledge without action is useless, and I would hate for you to leave this conversation inspired but unchanged. Here is what I want you to do this week. First, create a complete inventory of all your debts. List every balance, every interest rate, every minimum payment. Do not guess at the numbers. Look them up precisely. Knowledge is power, and you cannot make wise decisions about debt you do not fully understand. Many people are surprised when they do this exercise because they have been avoiding the full picture. Face it directly because clarity is the first step toward strategy. Second, calculate the effective after-tax cost of each debt. If you itemize deductions, and your mortgage interest is deductible, factor that in. If you are in a high-tax state, the deduction may be more valuable than you realize. For most debts other than mortgages, the stated rate and the effective rate are the same, but it is worth checking if any other deductions might apply. Third, research the long-term historical returns of a diversified investment portfolio and calculate what a reasonable expected return might be for your situation. I use 7% for conservative planning and 10% for historical averages. Your financial advisor can help you determine an appropriate assumption based on your risk tolerance and time horizon. Compare this expected return to your effective debt cost and notice where the arbitrage exists. Fourth, evaluate your current liquidity position. Do you have 6 months of expenses accessible without penalty? If not, building that buffer should be a priority regardless of what debt you carry. Security comes from liquidity, not from debt payoff. Do not sacrifice flexibility for the sake of paying down low-interest debt faster. Fifth, schedule a conversation with a fee-only financial advisor who can review your complete situation and help you develop a personalized strategy. Make sure they understand your values and goals, not just your numbers. The best financial advice takes both into account. Ask them specifically about the opportunity cost of accelerated debt payoff versus systematic investment, and see how they respond. A good advisor will give you a nuanced answer that accounts for your specific circumstances rather than reciting conventional wisdom automatically. I want to leave you today with a vision of what is possible when you embrace wise financial stewardship rather than fear-based debt elimination. Imagine reaching 70 with a modest mortgage payment that represents a small fraction of your monthly income, but also with a substantial investment portfolio generating dividends and growth. Imagine having the flexibility to help a grandchild with education or a child with a down payment, not because you refinanced your paid-off house in an emergency, but because you strategically built liquid wealth alongside your home equity. Imagine facing a medical crisis with the confidence that comes from having resources to handle whatever comes, rather than the desperation that comes from having all your wealth locked up in an illiquid asset. Imagine leaving a legacy that includes not just property, but also financial assets that can be deployed according to your heirs' specific needs and circumstances. This is not fantasy. This is achievable for most people who have stable income and reasonable expenses. But it requires breaking free from the conventional wisdom that says all debt is bad and that paying off your mortgage should take priority over everything else. It requires embracing a more sophisticated understanding of how wealth actually works and how successful families have built and preserved resources across generations. It requires trust in principles that may feel counterintuitive at first, but that have been tested and proven over time. I believe in you. I believe that you found this content for a reason, that something in you is ready for a different approach, that you have the wisdom and discipline to implement what you are learning. The path forward is not about working harder or sacrificing more. It is about thinking better and acting strategically. It is about deploying your resources in alignment with timeless principles rather than temporary rules. It is about building a financial future that honors God, serves your family, and positions you to be a blessing for years to come. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this message has resonated with you, if something has shifted in how you think about debt and wealth building, I would consider it a privilege to continue this journey with you. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and make sure notifications are on so you never miss an insight that could transform your financial future. Share this with someone you know who is struggling with debt pressure after 60, because they deserve to hear this perspective too. And leave a comment below telling me what specifically resonated with you and what questions remain. I read every comment, and your engagement helps me understand what topics to address in future content. Remember this: you are not defined by your debt. You are not a failure because you have a mortgage at 60 or 65 or 70. You are a steward with resources under your management, and your job is not to follow arbitrary rules, but to deploy those resources wisely in service of your goals and values. The conventional wisdom about debt after 60 is not serving you. It is time for a better way, a wiser way, a way that aligns with how wealth actually works and how successful families have always thought about money. You deserve financial peace that comes from understanding rather than financial stress that comes from following rules that do not apply to your situation. Go forward from here with confidence, with strategy, with the knowledge that you are not alone on this journey. I am here to guide you, and together we are going to build something that lasts. May your finances flourish as you apply wisdom to every decision. May your family be blessed by your strategic stewardship. May your legacy extend far beyond your lifetime. And may you experience the peace that comes from knowing you are managing God's resources in a way that honors Him and serves those you love. Before we truly close, I want to dig even deeper into something that has been on my heart throughout this entire message, and it is the spiritual dimension of what we are discussing. You see, money is never just about money. It is always about what money represents, what it enables, what it reveals about our hearts and our priorities. The way you handle your finances is a direct reflection of your theology, whether you realize it or not. Someone who hoards every penny and refuses to take any risk is practicing a theology of scarcity, regardless of what they profess on Sunday morning. Someone who gives generously and invests wisely is practicing a theology of abundance, trusting that God's provision is not limited and that wise stewardship multiplies rather than merely preserves. I have spent my life thinking about the intersection of faith and finance, and I have come to believe that most Christians have an impoverished understanding of both. They read verses about money out of context and arrive at conclusions that the original authors never intended. They take principles meant for specific situations and apply them universally without discernment. They confuse poverty with piety and wealth with wickedness, missing entirely the nuanced biblical picture that presents money as a tool that can be used for good or ill, depending on the heart of the one who wields it. Consider for a moment the resources required to accomplish great things in this world. The missionary who brings the gospel to unreached peoples requires funding for travel, supplies, and living expenses. The church that builds a new sanctuary to accommodate its growing congregation needs financial resources to make that vision reality. The family that wants to send their children to schools that will shape their character and expand their minds must have the means to pay tuition. The believer who feels called to support orphanages, feed the hungry, or care for the widow needs more than good intentions. They need resources that can be converted into tangible help. Money is the stored labor that makes these good works possible, and accumulating money wisely is therefore not greed, but preparation for impact. When you understand money this way, the question of debt takes on a different character entirely. It is not about moral purity or financial righteousness in some abstract sense. It is about positioning yourself to accomplish the purposes God has placed in your heart. If aggressive debt payoff leaves you with no resources to give, no flexibility to respond to needs, no capital to deploy when opportunities arise, then it is actually hindering your stewardship rather than honoring it. The paid-off house becomes an idol that you have sacrificed everything to achieve, rather than a tool that serves your larger purposes. I want you to think about the next 20 years of your life. What do you want those years to look like? What impact do you want to have? What legacy do you want to leave? Most people over 60 have never sat down and genuinely wrestled with these questions. They are so focused on survival, on not running out of money, on eliminating all risk and retreating to safety, that they never consider what they are actually living for. But you are not most people. You have stayed with me this long because something in you knows there is more, because you want your remaining years to matter, because you refuse to settle for a fearful existence when an abundant life is available. Here is what I know about people who make a real difference in the world. They think strategically about resources. They do not leave money sitting idle when it could be growing. They do not sacrifice all flexibility for the sake of false security. They position themselves to respond when opportunities arise, to give when needs present themselves, to act when God prompts them to move. This requires maintaining liquidity, building wealth, and yes, sometimes carrying strategic debt that frees up capital for higher purpose. I want to tell you about a principle that has guided my family's wealth building for generations, and it is simply this: never sacrifice the certain loss of opportunity for the uncertain avoidance of risk. Read that again and let it sink in. When you aggressively pay down low-interest debt instead of investing, you are making a certain sacrifice of investment returns to avoid an uncertain risk that may never materialize. You are guaranteeing that you will have less wealth in the future in exchange for feeling slightly more secure in the present. This is almost always a bad trade, and wise stewards recognize it immediately. The wealthy families I know The ones who have maintained and grown their resources across generations all understand this principle intuitively. They do not make decisions based on fear. They make decisions based on expected value, risk-adjusted returns, and strategic positioning. They are comfortable holding debt that costs them 3% when they can deploy that capital at returns of 7 or 10%. They understand that this is not irresponsibility but sophistication, not recklessness but wisdom. Now I want to address something that I suspect is lurking in the back of your mind, and it is the fear of looking foolish. You have spent your whole life following the conventional advice, making the extra payments, working toward debt freedom. What will people think if you suddenly stop? What will your spouse say? What about your children who have been taught that debt is always bad? What about the financial advisor who has been encouraging you to pay off your mortgage early? The social pressure to conform to conventional wisdom is immense, and breaking free from it requires courage. But let me ask you something. Do you want to make financial decisions based on what makes you look good to others? Or do you want to make financial decisions based on what actually works? Do you want to sacrifice your family's wealth on the altar of social conformity? Or do you want to think independently and act wisely regardless of what the crowd is doing? The wealthy have always been willing to be misunderstood in the short term, in exchange for results that vindicate them in the long term. They care more about outcomes than opinions, more about results than reputation. When you start making investment contributions instead of extra mortgage payments, some people will not understand. They will think you are being irresponsible. They will question your judgment. They might even express concern about your financial well-being. Do not let this deter you. In 10 or 20 years, when you have a substantial portfolio alongside a modestly mortgaged home, while they have paid off houses and empty bank accounts, the wisdom of your approach will be obvious to everyone. Until then, trust the math. Trust the principles. Trust the track record of sophisticated wealth builders throughout history. I also want to speak to those of you who are in marriages where financial decisions are made jointly. This is important because one of the biggest obstacles to implementing wise financial strategy is spousal disagreement. If your husband or wife is deeply committed to debt elimination, and you suddenly come home saying you want to stop making extra mortgage payments and start investing instead, you can expect resistance. This is natural and healthy. Big financial decisions should be discussed, debated, and decided together. Here is how I recommend approaching this conversation. First, acknowledge the values behind your spouse's position. They want security, stability, freedom from financial burden. These are good values that you share. You are not disagreeing about the goals. You are suggesting a different path to the same destination. Second, present the mathematics clearly. Show them the comparison between 10 years of extra mortgage payments versus 10 years of systematic investing. Let the numbers speak for themselves. Third, address their specific concerns. If they worry about market volatility, discuss how diversification and long-time horizons mitigate that risk. If they worry about foreclosure, explain that maintaining liquidity actually provides more protection than accelerated payoff. Fourth, suggest a compromise if necessary. Perhaps you invest half of your extra resources and put half toward the mortgage. This is not optimal from a pure numbers standpoint, but it might be necessary to maintain marital harmony, which has its own substantial value. The goal is not to win an argument. The goal is to arrive at a financial strategy that you both understand and support. A mediocre strategy that you execute together consistently will outperform an optimal strategy that creates constant conflict. Be patient with this process. The beliefs we hold about money run deep, and changing them takes time. Plant seeds of wisdom and let them grow. Let me share with you another concept that transformed how I think about money, and this one relates specifically to the relationship between time and wealth. You have probably heard the phrase "time is money," but I want to suggest that the reverse is actually more powerful. Money is time. Every dollar you have represents time that you can spend however you choose. Every dollar you spend is time that you no longer have. Every dollar you invest wisely is time that multiplies itself into more time. When you reach 60, you become acutely aware that your remaining time on this earth is limited. You can no longer assume you have decades ahead to recover from mistakes. Every year matters more than it did when you were young. This awareness should inform your financial decisions in important ways. It should make you more strategic, not more fearful. It should push you toward wise deployment of resources, not hoarding of resources. It should remind you that the purpose of money is not to have money, but to have options, flexibility, and the ability to respond to whatever life brings. A paid-off house does not give you more time. It locks up wealth in an illiquid form that cannot be easily accessed or deployed. An investment portfolio that generates income and grows over time does give you more time. It provides the resources that enable you to make choices about how you spend your remaining years. Do you want to work until you physically cannot anymore? Or do you want to have the option to reduce your hours, pursue passion projects, or serve your community? Do you want every unexpected expense to be a crisis? Or do you want to handle challenges with resources and equanimity? These are the real stakes of the financial decisions you make today. I am going to close with a story that illustrates everything we have been discussing. There were two brothers, both in their early 60s, both with similar incomes and expenses, both with homes worth about $400,000, with mortgages of around $200,000 remaining. One brother, we will call him the conventional brother, followed all the standard advice. He took every extra dollar and threw it at his mortgage. He cut back on vacations, drove an older car, and sacrificed present enjoyment for future debt freedom. After 12 years of dedicated effort, at 74 years old, he finally made his last mortgage payment. He was debt-free at last. The other brother, we will call him the strategic brother, took a different path. He continued making his regular mortgage payments, but invested his extra resources systematically in a diversified portfolio. He took reasonable vacations, maintained a comfortable lifestyle, and enjoyed the journey while also building wealth. After the same 12 years, at 74 years old, he still had about $100,000 remaining on his mortgage, but he also had an investment portfolio worth over $180,000, more than enough to pay off the mortgage if he chose to, with significant assets left over. Now here is where the story gets really interesting. At 76, both brothers faced unexpected health challenges that required significant out-of-pocket expenses. The conventional brother, with his paid-off house but limited liquid assets, had to take out a home equity line of credit to cover his medical bills. He was back in debt, now at higher interest rates and worse terms than his original mortgage. The strategic brother simply drew from his investment portfolio, covering his expenses without taking on any new debt and without touching his home equity. At 80, both brothers wanted to help their grandchildren with college expenses. The conventional brother looked at his paid-off house and his modest savings and realized he could not help without jeopardizing his own security. The strategic brother wrote checks from his portfolio, blessed his grandchildren with educational opportunity, and still had resources remaining. At 85, the conventional brother passed away, leaving his children a paid-off house and little else. The strategic brother passed away shortly after, leaving his children a house with a small remaining mortgage, plus a substantial investment portfolio that provided them options and flexibility. Which brother practiced better stewardship? Which one honored his resources more wisely? Which one left a better legacy? The answer is obvious when you step back and look at the whole picture. And yet, at every step along the way, the conventional brother thought he was being responsible while the strategic brother seemed reckless to outside observers. Conventional wisdom led to mediocre outcomes. Strategic thinking led to abundance. This is the opportunity in front of you right now. You can continue following the path that feels safe but produces limited results, or you can embrace a more sophisticated approach that positions you for genuine flourishing. The choice is yours, and nobody can make it for you. But I hope that after everything we have discussed today, you can see that there is a better way, a wiser way, a way that honors both your faith and your financial future. Go now and build something that lasts. Do not let fear drive your financial decision. Do not sacrifice wealth on the altar of conventional wisdom. Trust the principles that have built generational wealth for centuries and adapt them wisely to your own unique circumstances. Your best financial years can still be ahead of you, regardless of how old you are or how much debt you currently carry. It is never too late to become a strategic steward of the resources God has entrusted to you. The world needs more people of faith who understand money well enough to use it wisely. The world needs more believers who can fund the work of the kingdom because they have built resources through wise stewardship. The world needs more Christians who demonstrate through their lives that faith and financial sophistication are not opposites but partners. You can be one of those people. You can break free from the fear-based approach that has limited so many. You can embrace the abundant life that Jesus promised, including the financial dimension that makes so much good work possible. I believe in you. I believe in what God can do through you when you are properly resourced and strategically positioned. I believe that your best days are ahead, not behind. Now go and make it happen. The principles are clear. The path is open. All that remains is for you to take the first step.